In this life and death moment, I had to choose between saving my beloved Skylar and saving my mother, Rebekah. Raziel's blood was the only hope to stop Skylar from turning into a vampire. But my mother was also dying to save me. This moment of conflict between family and responsibility nearly broke me. Chapter 35. Gabriel's POV. I remained standing, in a state of complete and utter bewilderment as my brain frantically scrambled to put the pieces together. Cain had grown mostly still, the only detectable movement being his fingers that were still wrapped around the knife, twitching slightly, but I wasted no time in contemplating his fate, for I was torn between the girl flailing around and my mother, sprawled limply on the ground. I knew that I needed to grab Raziel and force him to save Skylar. My wolf was snarling at me to do so, but the very dormant, long-hidden side of me that actually had feelings of affection towards my family would not let me tear my eyes away from Rebekah. Only seconds had passed, but each one felt like an eternity. Raziel had moved forward and was crouched next to Rebekah. He was shaking her shoulder, his voice escaping as a hoarse croak as he cried her name. The angel's eyes, however, remained resigned. He had known this would happen. In the seconds before Rebekah stabbed Cain, Raziel had warned me with his expression. I took a step forward, then hesitated. Everything was coming together, along with the realization that Skylar's time was running out. As if on cue, her thrashing abruptly halted. Raziel, voice coming out much more roughly than I intended. The angel completely ignored me. I gently lowered Skylar to the ground, resting her against the side of the tunnel. I attempted to get her into a sitting position, but she was completely limp, head lolling to the side. Black veins still stood out in a startling contrast to her pale skin. If it weren't for her rapid heartbeat, I would have thought I was losing her to death claim. Raziel, I snapped, my eyes automatically landing on Rebekah's form again as I felt a piercing guilt. She was completely still, possibly dead, and some part of me wanted to go to her, but my wolf would not let me leave Skylar's side. Raziel's burning gaze flickered to me, and I saw evident anger. One hand rested on Rebekah's face, cupping her cheek, and I knew I was interrupting what could be his last months with his daughter. But right now, my wolf didn't care. Skylar needs your help. Just earning. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Rather harshly, and fury contorted Raziel's features. He was grieving, and I was not helping, and Rebekah is dying. To save your life, he hissed in response. The angel had never given me such a glare before. His electric blue eyes practically burned my skin. I opened my mouth to retort, losing my patience entirely, when a weak, shaky voice cut in. Father, the words were faint, a near whisper. Raziel's head abruptly snapped around and he focused on Rebekah. She had stirred slightly. Rebekah, but your confusion contorted Raziel's features, and he glanced from Cain before peering intently at his daughter. Cain is not yet dead. I can feel it. She sucked in a sharp intake of air that rasped against her throat. How? He is hovering on the brink, but your blood will not entirely kill him. Her voice had grown slightly in strength. Raziel soundlessly wrapped an arm around her shoulders and lifted her into a sitting position, moving her so she was braced against the wall much like Skylar was. My mother's normally glowing countenance was a pasty white, eyes completely dull. She looked like a corpse. I felt another burst of impatience as I heard a soft whine escape Skylar's lips. My wolf was almost in hysterics, and he wanted me to leap at Raziel and force his blood down Skylar's throat if I had to. But Cain helped Skylar, Rebekah whispered, as I prepared to snap at Raziel again. My mother's glazed eyes slowly focused on me. She is turning. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I will be fine for a few moments. The angel appeared ready to say no, but my wolf and I were relentless in our efforts to save our mate. You heard her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. You're the only one that can help. Please. Skylar turning is the last thing I want. Raziel signed heavily, resignation returning once more to the icy depths of his eyes. I, too, felt a wave of regret and sadness wash over me, but I could not allow it to control my actions. I would never forgive myself if something happened to Skylar. He left Rebekah slumping against the wall of the tunnel, right where it opened up to the outside world. Some distant part of my brain aimlessly wondered where the others were. It had only been a few minutes since I contacted everyone, but it felt like hours. Raziel crouched in front of Skylar, who was lightly panting, eyes still tightly shut. I was partially supporting her so she wouldn't collapse onto the ground. The angel's wrists were still coated in scarlet liquid from where Hed cut himself to ward off Cain with his blood. He glanced at me briefly, giving me a full view of the exhaustion and grief in the depths of his expression. This is not going to be pleasant, he stated dully. My mate turning into a vampire would be worse, was my short reply, because the knife was stuck into Cain's torso. Raziel would not be able to create any new injuries. All we could do was hope that the slices on his wrists were still bleeding enough to burn the vampire blood of Skylar system. I gently brushed some of the sweaty, matted hair away from Skylar's forehead, and tipped her head back. Raziel raised his arm, glancing at me again for confirmation. I nodded once. Gabriel, if it's too late, my blood will just, we have to try. I snapped irritably. I already knew the risks, and I could not dwell on them. I could not let her turn. Sighing heavily, the angel reached around and gripped the back of Skylar's neck with one hand, forcing her head forward until her open mouth connected with his bleeding wound. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and I wondered if she was even conscious enough to realize there was blood trickling into her mouth. Would the stench of blood repulse her as a werewolf? Or were her vampire senses already potent enough to recognize it as food? I soon got my answer as Skylar's blue eyes snapped open, shifting back and forth in a panic as she began to struggle. A gurgling noise escaped her throat and her hands came up, clawing at Raziel's arm as she attempted to pull it away from her face. Her nails left bloody furrows in the angel's skin, making him wince. I maneuvered myself so that I could pin one of her arms and part of her body, but from my angle there was only so much I could do. Skylar began to hiss ferociously, struggling harder, and Raziel's expression grew strained as he tried to keep his bleeding wrist latched to her mouth. I reached up and pressed her against the wall harder, wedging her head so she cowled and turned away from the blood. I knew it was burning her. I could tell as her face contorted with pain and a keening wail emerged from deep inside her chest. Part of Skylar must have known we were helping her, but her body's instinctive reaction was to escape the pain. My wolf had, too, but we had to get the angel's blood into her system. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Skylar, we're trying to help you, I attempted to speak soothingly, but my tone was strained. Raziel was crouched at an angle where the blood could drip down into her mouth, but Skylar was stronger than he was. This left it up to me to restrain her as much as I could. As her cries of pain grew louder and her struggles more frantic, I realized this was a nearly impossible task. Skylar abruptly wrenched her head to the side, and Raziel's grip loosened enough for her face to get free, her mouth coated in crimson. She hissed ferociously, face feral and nearly unrecognizable as she glared up at the angel. Whatever Cain had done to her, his blood was putting up a fight and contorting her world into one of delusion where we were the enemy. Skylar. I grabbed her chin in one hand and swung her head to face me. Her eyes were glazed and very focused, darting around the cave in a panic. Even my voice was not reaching her. I wrapped my other arm around my mate to contain her struggles, but she fought me valiantly. Skylar. I tried again, and this time my wolf added his voice to mine, begging our mate to recognize us, to turn away from the demon blood inside of her. She hesitated, eyes flicking back to mine and a look of confusion hovering in their depths. Raziel took a momentary stillness to press his other injured wrist against her open mouth. I rapidly brought my hand up to secure the back of her head, The sound of the angelic blood burning Skylar's throat was practically audible, and my wolf waned in recognition of her pain. I gritted my teeth and held her, and in our position I was strong enough to restrain her. Raziel was much paler than normal, his free hand squeezing the forearm so the blood would stream out more freely. "How much will it take?" I whispered harshly, Skylar's pained gurgles starting to get to me. Sweat beaded on my forehead from the forced detainment of my mate. "I don't know." He forced out, and I saw his own face was damp with perspiration. An abrupt voice resounding inside my head almost made me jump. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." We dismembered these vampires, but Rebekah told us to remain on guard here. Should we? Eli queried. I cut him off before he could continue. "I can't talk right now. Sweep the perimeter for vampires, then meet me at the back entrance to the tunnel." I closed my mind off without another word. He would have to figure out what to do as Beta was very much occupied. Seconds continued to trickle by, and I noticed that her struggles were weakening. I was not sure whether to take that as a good sign. Raziel less rapidly, paling face, however, was ominous enough. I felt my heartbeat increase in tempo as I worried that we weren't fast enough. That the angel blood could not prevent Skylar from turning into a monster that I couldn't even protect my only. Just what I was prepared to howl in frustration. Skylar stilled, her eyes rolling into the back of her head. Her heart stuttered before slowing into an even pace. The dark Spiderberg veins beneath her skin was fainter now, fading back into a normal cup. Raziel released her and stepped back, breathing heavily from exertion. I knew I should thank him later, but all I could focus on was Skylar, silently slumped against the wall again. Unconsciously I reached forward and cupped her face. My wolf was straining against the thin walls of my consciousness, itching to emerge and curl protectively around our mate. I maneuvered Skylar so she was resting in my lap. The steady heartbeat was reassuring, but she was so oddly still. I didn't know what I would do if she was gone. I'd always thought myself to be strong, but I wouldn't know how to survive without her. The vampires had known right from the start when they kidnapped her that she was my kryptonite. Even I, the wolf who had always been skeptical about the mate concept, knew now what it meant to love someone. It had definitely been a journey, and I had put her through hell. I wasn't even sure I deserved her as a mate. It seemed unfair that Skylar should be stuck with someone like me. She was perfect in every sense of the word, and I was, well, difficult. I supposed love made you simultaneously strong and weak. Really, it was an inconvenience that, years ago, I never would have welcomed. It was kind of ridiculous that one person could be the center of someone's universe, that I couldn't argue with the feelings I had for the girl sleeping almost peacefully on my lap. It was both heartwarming to be with her and heart-wrenching thinking about what could happen to her. I would never let her out of my sight again. Skylar's POV. Once again, I was trapped in impenetrable darkness. The darkness swirled around me, hugging me in a tight embrace, not letting me escape. I was aware of a dull pain that had been like fire through my veins that was now receding. In the distance, I felt a presence, a welcoming entity that I was desperately trying to find. In this blackness, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I was lost and alone. I wondered if I would forever be trapped here. It already felt like I'd been in this empty land for weeks. Where was I? I racked my brains for the last thing I could remember. The last flash of color I'd seen before the darkness came in. I remembered malevolence, the smell of death, and burning pain. I tossed and turned, neither sitting nor standing in the emptiness that surrounded me. I wondered if I was trapped in my consciousness, if something was keeping me here. Why couldn't I get out? Was I dead? No, that couldn't be it, they said when you were dead. You saw the light at the end of the tunnel. My world was completely dark. I couldn't even feel my wolf, and that was possibly the most terrifying thing of all. She was just gone. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. but not in this world with me. Perhaps this was just hell. And the humans had been right after all. That death resigned you to an infinity of torture. Being alone in a dark world was torture to me. Being without him was torture. Thinking of Gabriel seemed to snap everything into place. I couldn't remember anything before. But my brain was growing increasingly coherent amidst the blackness, and I could now remember what I cherished most, my mate. I fixated his face in my mind's eye, hoping he could pull me out from wherever I was. I pictured his regal features, the eyes and hair black as night, the perfectly sculpted lips that I had grown more and more acquainted with. As I thought about my mate, the darkness seemed to lighten. I pictured his chiseled body, the way he held me our last night together, and it melded against him perfectly. I thought of our many arguments, and even my furious anger that HED left me and the betrayal it felt. The loneliness, worse even than what I felt in this dark, empty world. The darkness transitioned into a light grey. I thought of the understanding, the fact that he'd come to terms with a long time ago without realizing, the inevitable fact my wolf had known before me. I loved him. It should not have been a surprise, since we were destined to be together. But after everything that had happened, I still knew for sure. I was completely in love with him. That's when I heard my name being called, and the grey world around me receded. It was him calling my name. Gabriel was here with me. The deep, masculine voice called to me, and just like that, I was drawn from the empty world and my eyes snapped open. I winced, even the very dim lighting seeming incredibly bright after where it'd been. My eyes slowly adjusted, and I blinked, focusing on the werewolf hovering above me. As I saw Gabriel in all of his glory, my heart skipped a beat, fluttering in my chest like a caged bird. He was so perfect, and he was staring at me as if my awakening was a miracle. His dark eyes were swirling with a multitude of emotions, intensely boring into me as my mate began to scan every inch of my face as if to make sure I was really there. In that moment, I realized I could feel every single thing that Gabriel felt. He had lowered his mental walls and connected our minds again. The re-establishment of the connection made me feel wholly complete, like a missing piece clicked into place, and I realized how much I'd missed him. I tried to convey everything I felt through our mental link, but I communicated it aloud. Gabriel, I choked out, my voice coming out alarmingly raspy. I began to sit up before realizing Gabriel cradled me in his lap, the side of my body pressed up against his chest. I was molded against him, the heat of his body warming my cool skin. My cheeks reddened when I realized I was completely naked, which was inevitable after shifting. Gabriel had already seen everything there was to see, but it was still an uncomfortable situation. He too was unclothed, and in any other circumstance, it would have seemed highly appropriate with others around, even though nudity was customary for werewolves in the same pack. Right now, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. There were more important things going on. I'm so glad you're okay. Fingers brushing the bare skin of my back and sending tingles shooting up and down my spine. His touch soothed my frayed nerves, and I realized my wolf was still with me, that she was whining frantically in my consciousness. I was fading, I was almost gone. She whimpered with evident fear. I attempted to calm her, but it was Gabriel's touch that did the trick as he pulled me even closer, his muscular arms wrapped around my torso. He was so incredibly relieved that I wondered how long he'd been out. I wasn't even sure what to say in that moment. A tiny part of me urged me to tell him off for abandoning me, but I was so glad to see him that I couldn't get the words past the lump in my throat. I winced, my body warmer than usual and aching. I felt like I had run for miles and miles. What had happened to me? I tentatively reached a hand up and brushed it against the side of his face. I could feel the light stubble on his jaw, and I keenly noticed that beneath his ethereal beauty, Gabriel almost looked haggard. My thoughts were interrupted when his dark eyes warmed with an emotion that practically caught my whole body on fire. I could feel the heat of his emotions tenfold through our bond. What happened? I rasped, echoing my train of thought. Gabriel's brow furrowed and his lips flattened into a thin line. Whatever happened, it hadn't been good. Gabriel, a voice cut in, sounding miserable and bereft. It was so contorted with pain that I could barely recognize it as Raziel, and the sound of it made me start to struggle into a sitting position in alarm. Gabriel supported me until I could observe my surroundings. I was near the entrance to a tunnel of some sort, and scant moonlight filtered in. There was a hunched body near us, and I felt my mouth open in shock as I realized it was a motionless Kane. Is Kane but he? The informed question stopped as my eyes fell upon Raziel and a pale Rebekah, hunched against the entrance to the tunnel and looking as lifeless as the vampire. Kane tried to turn you, and then he ran. Rebekah stabbed him, and then she just Gabriel. Looking grim, gestured helplessly. I could see confusion on his face, and I knew he was torn between his mother and me. His wolf wanted him to stand by his mate, but the part of Gabriel that still cared about Rebekah wanted to go to her. I couldn't even think about Kane trying to turn me. It was immensely disturbing, and I wasn't sure my fragile mental state could handle it right now. All I knew was that my wolf was still with me, so somehow they'd stopped Kane's malevolent plan. I hadn't even known vampires could turn werewolves. Go to her, Gabriel. They'll be fine, I said weakly. His sharp gaze focused on me. In not letting you go, while the gesture was heartwarming, I still felt my insides constricting as I put the pieces together. Rebekah, is she? Not yet. Is Kane dead? I already knew the answer before Gabriel shook his head, and I realized what Rebekah had done. Somehow, she had used her blood instead of Gabriel's. That had to be the only possible explanation. She had been willing to sacrifice herself for her son. The notion sent a hot spike of pain stabbing through me, leaving me nearly breathless as I realized that Rebekah could not live. Not if we wanted to rid the world of Kane. The blood, it worked both ways, I said softly, staring at the woman's near, prone figure. Rebekah's breathing seemed to be painful, and her eyes were shut. Tendrils of dark hair were stuck to her face with perspiration. I didn't know. Gabriel replied, just as quietly, a wealth of pain in his voice and in his feelings. I felt a wave of guilt crash over me, even though I was sure why. I wished I would have known her plan. Surely we could have come up with another way. Gabriel, she will want to see you, I whispered, urging him on with a pleading glance. My mate hesitated, clearly reluctant to let me go. I did not want him to release me, but I knew what he had to do. If he had been about to protest, Raziel cut him off. Gabriel, she wants to talk to you, the angel said lifelessly. Yet again, I felt as if someone was gripping my heart and squeezing it. The angel was losing his only daughter. I turned my head away, unable to bear the sight as tears pricked the back of my eyes. I almost wanted to go over and crouch beside her, but did not want to interfere with their familiar moment. After a moment of still silence, Gabriel gently moved me off of his lap, placing my back against the firm cavern wall. His hands lingered on me a bit longer than necessary, making my skin prickle with heat. He gazed at me for a moment, eyes burning with a heavy emotion that had my mind reeling, before moving over to the others and crouching down by his mother. I was only about 10 feet from Rebekah, so I could hear everything she said, and the sound of her rattling breaths escaping her weakened body. I felt like I was intruding, but my body was much weaker than normal and I was sure I'd be able to get up. My eyes found Kane's figure, slouched against the tunnel wall across from me, my body mere feet away from his. I found the close distance to be repulsive, his head lolled to the side, the vampire's skin even paler than normal. The hilt of a knife protruded from his chest and one of the monster's hands was loosely clasped around it, as if he'd been trying to remove the weapon. I would have thought he was dead, but Rebekah's state told me otherwise. The bastard was incredibly hard to kill. I felt my fangs sharpen slightly as I stared at the bloodsucker, loathing coursing through me. I could feel my wolf's hatred echoing my own. Rebekah's weak voice cut off my vindictive train of thought. Sorry I didn't tell you, she murmured quietly. Gabriel was crouched next to her, a confusing jumble of emotions. He still felt a tenuous connection to his mother, but he had been so long without her that he wasn't even sure how to feel. His grief was obvious, but it was different than the grief a normal wolf would feel when losing a parent. He had never really known her. "I wouldn't have let you," Gabriel replied gruffly after a pause. I noticed that Raziel had stood up and walked a few feet away, staring out into the starry night sky. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." There was a pause as Rebekah took a shaky breath. "None of your pack knew. Just Raziel." Gabriel was silent, but I could feel the sadness and resignation. He knew what he had to do, or what he was supposed to do. I was sure if my mate could bring himself to finish the job. Despite my loathing for Cain, I knew I wouldn't have the strength to do it if it were up to me. I was the worst possible mother, Rebekah said sadly, tone heavy with disgust that I knew was directed at herself. "I don't. You did what you had to do." Gabriel cut her off shortly. I felt his confusion through her mind. Link. He wanted to forgive her, but years of his father's abuse made it hard. Now I felt even more like an intruder. I peeked at them out of the corner of my eye, not wanting to be caught full on staring. Rebekah tilted her head up, her now dull brown eyes meeting her son's. "And now it's your turn. Do what you must." Gabriel tensed and looked away, his jaw working. Raziel's form had gone rigid from where he stood just outside the tunnel. "You have to," Rebekah urged. "You can't let him live." She sighed heavily. "You know that. You're that willing to die." There was evident pain laced in Gabriel's voice. "Just after you woke up. At least I can finally do something for you." Gabriel growled with frustration, but I knew he was just putting off the inevitable. I bit my lip, willing the tears to stay away. Gabriel didn't need my grief coupled with his. Cain is like poison to this world. He needed to be stopped. "We could have found another way," Gabriel argued. "You would have died following your plan." "Skylar." To Rebekah's voice seemed slightly stronger. I wondered if this meant Cain was recovering from his injuries. I idly wondered how they managed to bring him down in the first place. Gabriel remained silent, knowing she was right. Rebekah sighed softly, raising one delicate hand and resting it on Gabriel's face. I felt Gabriel's internal reaction to the foreign contact, but he did not pull away. Some distant part of him relished the unfamiliar touch. His wolf, however, did not like being touched from someone other than his mate, not even his own mother. "He will recover soon." Raziel's blood was not enough to finish him. Rebekah glanced at Cain, dislike briefly glimmering in her eyes. "At stronger than the normal vampire you will have to do it. I don't think anyone else can." Her hand fell away from Gabriel's face and rested in her lap. Just then, my ears pricked as I heard a faint commotion from outside, the sound of massive wolves in the distance. They were still pretty far from our location, but my keen hearing could pick up such sound from half a mile away. I scented the air, determining the group to be a mixture of artifacts. Raziel stood stiffly, like a sentry, while Gabriel turned to face the area outside the tunnel. Through our connection I sensed that he was contacting the others, telling them to wait a moment before approaching us. As the noise of massive paws trampling the earth lowered, Rebekah's eyes found mine. "Take care of him, Skylar," she whispered, voice laden with affection. There was a warmth in her brown eyes despite the haze of pain, and I felt my own filling with tears. "You're the best thing that ever happened to him." As I could do was nod, my vision blurry. I knew Rebekah would not want my pity, but I cowed and felt the stab of empathy I felt for her. She had just reunited with her family, and now she was leaving them. "Gabriel, you have to finish him now," she whispered. Gabriel stared at her, some sort of mental understanding passing between them. I felt a wave of grief crash over my mate that he tried to hold at bay, along with a burst of longing. He had never known what it was like to have an affectionate parent. Not the way I had. "I don't want everyone to see this. Thank you for telling them to wait," she continued. "But now you have to hurry. His strength is returning." Gabriel took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "You couldn't have made me prouder," Rebekah said, so quietly they scarcely caught it. and I got the impression that I was meant to hear it. Gabriel swallowed hard. His dark eyes held mine for a moment, and for once he was making no attempt to hide the pain away from me. I tried to maintain eye contact, to smooth my expression into one of encouragement. I knew he detected my grief over his mother's fate, but I didn't want to make things worse for him. Gabriel turned back to his mother, fixing his eyes on her. They were no doubt having a mental conversation. Their eyes remained locked as Gabriel rose to his full height and took a deep breath. Then, to my surprise, he began to shift, fur erupting from his skin and his body contorting as he transitioned into wolf form. The sound of his bones cracking and molding into wolf shape resonated in the cavern, where he stood on 4 legs. He turned to face Cain, a low growl erupting from his throat. The beast's eyes were focused on the vampire, who I realized was beginning to stir. I was momentarily confused before my wolf responded to my question before I could even ask it. He has to behead him. It's the only way to make sure. The thought made my stomach lurch, but I knew she was right. Tearing Cain's head off would be no easy feat. It was like killing a normal vampire. Every ounce of the bloodsucker's makeup was stronger than any other vampire. I didn't think any wolf besides Gabriel would have the brute strength necessary to finish the job. Lip curling into a fearsome snarl, Gabriel took a few steps forward until his massive form was in the center of the tunnel, between Cain and I. The tunnel was wider since it was near the exit, but there was still scarcely any room, and I could have reached out and touched Gabriel had I wanted to. His thick tail was inches from my face. Another growl tore from Gabriel's throat, his sharp claws digging into the ground as his shoulders hunched. He didn't want to do it. There were so many more things that he wanted to say to Rebekah, but Cain was groaning and shifting position. If the vampire pulled the dagger out of his chest, there was no telling what would happen. My peripheral vision caught Raziel, crouched next to Rebekah and whispering something to her that I cowed and hear over Gabriel's angry growls that were riddled with grief and regret. Cain groaned again. A few heartbeats passed, the tension building until I couldn't endure it any longer. Gabriel's growls reverberated around the tunnel, and Rebekah was looking away, outside towards the night sky while Raziel clutched her hand. Gabriel's massive head turned and he surveyed her one last time, heart hardening with resolve. Then, in a blur of motion, he lunged. I couldn't help it. I looked away. Perhaps it was cowardly, refusing to observe the vanquishing of my greatest enemy, but I didn't care. I couldn't watch Cain or Rebekah die. I couldn't watch the brutal killing that would take Gabriel's mother from this world forever. I looked to the side, back into the darkness of tunnel, and squeezed my eyes shut. Gabriel let out a short breath of exertion, which was followed a loud snapping sound. Cain's cry of agony was cut off by a disgusting squelching noise that muffled Gabriel's fearsome growl. The stench of blood slowly permeated the air. The blood was tainted, sickening, and I tasted bile in my throat. I dug my nails into the skin of my palms, pushing the gruesome images out of my head. Something dropped to the ground and rolled, and I did not have to look to know that Cain had successfully been beheaded. I heard the vampire's body slide down the wall and flop onto the dirt. Some part of me felt a burst of triumph, knowing that he was gone forever. But this feeling was short-lived. Inevitably, I turned to face Rebekah. Gabriel's mother had stilled completely. Her head was turned away from me so I could not see her face, but I didn't have to in order to know she was dead. Her body was just an empty shell now, which is why I was left in complete shock when her body began to glow. It was subtle at first, a glimmer underneath her pale skin, but as 3 pair of eyes focused on her still form, the light grew brighter. My breath caught in my throat. The ethereal glowing increased in brightness and I blinked rapidly to adjust. Whence Gabriel began, having abruptly shifted back to human form, but Raziel cut him off with a jerk of his hand. The angel's expression was one of complete captivation, mouth open in awe of what he was beholding. I got the impression he knew what was going on. Rebekah glowed brighter and brighter, yet her body remained still. The light emanating from underneath her skin was a whitish gold, and I almost thought I was dreaming. I could think of no logical explanation for what was happening. Once again, The glow increased until it was practically blinding. I was forced to close my eyes against the overwhelming light streaming from her body and obscuring her from our view. It was as if Rebekah were concealed behind a giant orb of brilliance. I could still see it imprinted against the blackness of my closed eyelids. I half opened one eye, determined to figure out what was happening. The glow was pulsating like it had a heartbeat. I felt the vibrations against my skin as the pulse radiated outwards twice. The radiance increased further, and I was forced to turn away for fear of my sight being burned away. Somehow, despite the overwhelming situation, I was not afraid. I instinctively knew that the brightness was good. I felt the heat of Rebekah's glow against my skin, and the pulsing increased in frequency. Once, twice. I lost count of the number of pulses as they grew closer together. But the glow was growing hotter the faster the pulses came. Just when I thought that the pulsing, glowing heartbeats were reaching a peak, everything abruptly stopped. The light vanished, throwing us into darkness again that seemed more absolute than before. I tentatively opened my eyes. Blinking rapidly, bright spots hung in my vision and it took me several seconds to adjust. The world almost seemed emptier now that the orb of brilliance was gone. Rebekah remained in the same position as before. Yet something was undoubtedly different. Gabriel was standing stock still, absolutely transfixed. Raziel had a look of wonder etched on his features. I don't believe it. The angel breathed, breaking the shocked silence. She ascended. What? Gabriel asked. I was equally befuddled. When angels are punished by being sent to earth, they can redeem themselves. It usually takes centuries, but when heaven deems that they've made up for their wrongdoing, they ascend. They return to heaven. You're saying Rebekah, her soul just ascended? Returned to heaven. I've never witnessed an ascension before. And she's not even a pure angel. Raziel's eyes were alight with relief. My brain was trying to wrap around the subject of souls. And heaven, without much success. Why would heaven accept her if she's half werewolf? Gabriel asked cautiously. As confused as I was, she gave her life for a noble cause, and destroyed a being of pure evil. Heaven must have decided she earned her place, even though she's only a half-blood. So is she a full angel now? I cut in, curiosity getting the better of me. I was sure whether I should be grieving her death or rejoicing her ascension. She must be. I'd never expected this. I was denied my chance to ascend once I committed a sin on earth my wings. I thought Rebekah would be resigned to the same fate, coupled with the fact that she's not a pure angel. But it seems like killing the oldest vampire is a worthy enough feat to let in. Gabriel shook his head. She's still gone, he said bitterly. And I echoed his sentiment. But she's in the best place she can possibly be. It's an honor. It's better than I ever could have expected. Raziel breathed, leaning forward. He gently pushed some hair away from Rebekah's pale face. I saw a look of sadness flicker across the angel's features, but he quickly subdued it. I knew I should be happy, since Raziel obviously thought it was the best thing that could have happened. But seeing Rebekah's empty, glassy brown eyes was still deeply unsettling. Even knowing her soul was in a better place could not ease the grief of losing her here. Gabriel's thoughts were as confused and jumbled as my own. He stared at his mother's lifeless body, jaw clenched and hands curled tightly into fists. Raziel suddenly spoke up. She will want a funeral as a werewolf. Without another word, the angel moved forward and lifted his daughter and before Gabriel could move a muscle. Again, I saw the sadness cross his expression, and I knew he was still mourning her death despite her ascension into heaven. He was putting on a very brave face, probably for Gabriel's benefit. I forced down my sadness and tried to struggle into a standing position. Gabriel came over to support me, wrapping a muscular arm around my torso and lifting me to my feet. His touch made goosebumps to rise on my skin, and I felt like I was home again. I glanced up at him, examining the grin set to his perfect features. His countenance was rigid as he tried to adjust to the fact that his mother was gone almost as soon as she got here. My mate's eyes met mine, and he didn't need any words to convey all of the emotions he was feeling. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, choked up with emotion and trying to hold the tears off. He shook his head slowly, then leaned forward, lips pressing a feather, light kiss to my forehead. I felt my entire body heat up and I pulled Gabriel into a tight hug. It felt like forever ago that a hug would have been a monumental step forward in our relationship. Now it was a necessity. Gabriel crushed me against his chest and I felt his heartbeat. Strong and steady. "It's what she wanted," he finally whispered. I had no reply to that. Gabriel began to lead me out of the tunnel, me leaning heavily on him for support. Raziel was outside holding Rebekah's still phone. He looked very drawn, but I knew there was no chance he was letting go of his daughter. Despite the angel's exhaustion, he clutched her tightly to his chest. He had known her better than Gabriel had, so I supposed it was only right. I averted my gaze yet again, feeling my throat constrict. Skylar Gabriel started once we were outside. He turned me to face him, large hands gripping my elbows to hold me in place. I stared up at him expectantly, memorizing every detail of his face as I drank him in. "I never should have left you," his guilt resounded through our bond. "No, you shouldn't have," I replied softly. "But I understand why you did." I was too tired even to be angry at this point. I was sure that would come later. "I couldn't have you trying to stop me," he spoke almost ironically. "Well, I tried anyways." Gabriel's eyes inadvertently glanced towards his mother. He released a heavy breath. "I'll make it up to you. I know it must have been hard. I barely got through it." I blinked, surprised he was admitting to his own weakness. It isn't pleasant waking up after your first night with your mate, only to find he is abandoned and you right after marking you. I couldn't help a bit of resentment from leaking into my voice, left over from that terrible morning. "It had nothing to do with you, Skylar. You know that," Gabriel replied heatedly, his normally impenetrable dark eyes burning into mine with fervor. I got the impression he'd been wanting to say this for a while. "You were perfect," he added mentally. Gabriel's eyes traveled down my body lazily and then back up to my face, and I could feel the affection radiating through our bond. I blushed and cowed in reply, standing next to a naked Gabriel while I myself was unclothed, referring back to the night where we completed the mating ritual. Set my thoughts very much astray. It just didn't feel appropriate for this moment, but my animal instincts couldn't help it. This whole situation felt surreal. Having this conversation and knowing Kane was lurking right around the corner anymore. A sudden thought occurred to me, and my eyes trailed down to Gabriel's neck. How could I not have noticed the significance of his red mark before? It was still there, prominently displayed on his skin. Sure, it could just be taking a while to fade, but it was still encouraging. "We don't have to worry anymore, do we?" I asked timidly after a moment of silence. I heard commotion in the distance and realized Gabriel had called to the others. I felt a burst of anxiety to make sure everyone was okay. I knew my parents were fine, because I still felt the dormant mental link to them. But I prayed Maria and Will were safe too. Gabriel glanced at Raziel, who stood as still as a statue, cradling his daughter. At least he knew her fate was a good one, but that couldn't make it much easier. Gabriel's gaze then traveled to the tunnel where, just beyond the fringe of darkness, Kane's corpse lay. I did not follow his gaze to see the bloodsucker's mutilated body. I did not need to double check to know he was dead. I could feel it in the open air, in the complete absence of evil. His coven must be gone. Tui had done the world a great favor. Well, more specifically, Rebekah had done the world a great favor. Kane and his minions were gone. Echoing my sentiments, Gabriel nodded his head once, firmly. Epilogue. 3 days later, the rain poured heavily from the sky in torrents, plastering my clothes tightly to my skin. My hair was drenched and stuck to my face in curly tendrils, but I paid it no mind. If I were human, I would have been very cold, because this time of year the rain was icy and could be quite brutal. I glanced up briefly at the overcast sky, blinking away the drops that splattered against my face. The weather was perfectly suited for today. Today, we were honoring the werewolves that had died in the battle. 3 had died fighting the vampires. Rebekah, To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Had given her life so Cain would no longer walk this earth. Another of the Black Mountain's pact members had gone down as well. I hadn't been well acquainted with him, but I felt his loss through Gabriel. I had been struck with no small amount of horror when I saw the last victim, because I recognized her. It was Bree, who had come with us on my first tour of the Black Mountains pack. She had sparred with me during my first test upon coming to their land. Apparently she was brought down in a 2-on-1 fight, and had died valiantly. Still, my grief had worsened when I saw the others carrying her limp body. The funerals for the latter 2 wolves had already come and gone, and their families carried away the bodies to have a few more minutes with them before nature took over. Now it was Rebekah's turn. I blinked away my grief, riddled thoughts as I saw my mate's lodge from approaching through the thick sheets of pouring rain. As always, the sight of Gabriel warmed my heart in ways it never thought possible. Even a day like today could not prevent my body's natural reaction to him. When he stood next to me, we locked eyes for a long moment. Rivulets of rain trickled down Gabriel's face, and this close, I could see the drops clinging to his dark eyelashes. His eyes were heavily lidded with grief. I was sure I looked no better. He had already laid Rebekah down on the large, flat rock, and the rest of the wolves were gathered on the other side of the massive clearing. The wolves that had formerly belonged to my pack were here, too, despite the fact that they hadn't known her. Everyone knew of her sacrifice. She was a hero in our world, and apparently in the angels' world too. Thinking of angels made my eyes flicker to where Raziel was standing, a few feet from Gabriel on his other side. The angel's ethereal features were inscrutable. I knew the concept of a werewolf funeral must have been uncomfortable to him, but he was vehement that it was what Rebekah wanted. I wondered when Nadie had occasion to talk about it. Perhaps when she initially told him of her plan. I felt he tries to my cheeks. An automatic reaction. When Gabriel's fingers intertwined with mine and he pulled me to his side, I leaned my head against him, staring at the beautiful woman lying on the rock. Most of her body was covered, but her face had been left exposed so we could gaze upon her one last time. Even in death, Rebekah looked commanding and regal. It was not hard to imagine her as a Luna. Her dark hair cascaded down the side of the rock, stuck to the surface because of the heavy rain. Gabriel's expression was smooth, but I felt his inner turmoil. I squeezed his hand tightly, sending a wave of comfort through our mental bond. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Are you ready?" I asked quietly, so the others cowled here. He glanced at me and nodded once, pulling me even more tightly against him. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. When Gabriel and Raziel went to return Rebekah's body to Mother Nature, as was custom, I wandered away from the clearing towards the nearest tree. It had been a beautiful and heart-wrenching funeral. The emotion had poured out of every wolf present, even those that hadn't known Rebekah but for her sacrifice. Gabriel had wanted me to come along with them, but some instinct deep down had told me it wasn't my place. I was Gabriel's mate, so in some way I was Rebekah's family, but I could sense that Raziel did not want me to accompany them. I cowed and blamed him. It seemed fitting that only her flesh and blood would accompany her to her final resting place. When my aimless wandering finally brought me to the tiny nearby stream, I sat down on a rock next to the bank. The rain had slowed slightly but still fell relentlessly from the sky. I paid it no mind, letting it drip from my clothes and puddle on the rock around me as I sat in rumination. The last 3 days were chaotic, but the simple knowledge that Cain was dead brought great relief to all of us. It was almost as if the air was cleaner now, knowing the bloodsucker and his coven weren't polluted. I knew there was still a long journey ahead. I was Luna, and the vibrant red mark on my pale skin was a daily reminder of how far I had to go. Gabriel's mark was still present, and I was going to cherish that fact every day. Maybe it would fade. Maybe it wouldn't. All I knew was that I would cross that bridge when I came to it. I couldn't spend every day worrying about something that was not necessarily an inevitability. I wanted each moment with my mate to count. I had to make up for lost time, especially for the years Gabriel had spent convincing himself he'd never have a mate. You stopped overthinking everything and just trusted your instincts, my wolf remarked dryly, and I rolled my eyes. I tilted my head up, staring mindlessly up into the endless grey. I had a lot to be thankful for. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilbang, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I had met the one I was destined to love. And love him I did. My family and friends were safe. The pack would soon be constructing the third village, where a lot of us would be residing, and the two groups of werewolves were getting along exceedingly well. All things considered. Still, there was some niggling thought at the back of my mind that I could not push away. Call it instinct, or sixth sense, or just my wolf's paranoia, but something told me that there was still going to be some great obstacle to overcome, whether 1 year from now or 10 years from now. Or perhaps I was paranoid. With Gabriel by us, we can do it. My wolf spoke up, smoothly and confidently. I agreed with her. My wolf's tone suddenly grew more serious. He will definitely need us. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He never really knew Rebekah, but she was still his mother. He knows we're here for him. You should vocalize our feelings for him. I'm sure he senses them, but it can't hurt to say it aloud. Against my will, I felt my cheeks reddening with a blush. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Gabriel had to know I loved him, but my wolf had a point. I needed to say it aloud. After another hour of deep thought, I heard Gabriel's voice suddenly emanate in my head. Where are you? I sent him a mental picture of where I was sitting, and I knew the instant he set off to come find me. The grief still riddled his thoughts, but a sense of peace was creeping it. His time alone with his family must have really helped. I stood up to greet Gabriel when he emerged from the trees. I could not help but notice the way his eyes lit up when they met mine, and he made his way over to me in a few quick strides. His strong arms enveloped me, pulling me to his chest in a tight hug. I slowly inhaled his masculine scent, reveling in the calm that washed over me as I did so. It's done, he muttered quietly. I buried my face deeper in his chest, clutching him tightly for comfort. His shirt was soaking wet, and it was impossible to miss the hard contours of his chest beneath my hands. A prickle of heat emerged within me as Gabriel lowered his head, his nose skimming the side of my neck. His hot breath against my cool skin made me shiver. Are you okay? Trying to distract myself from my traitorous thoughts. I shouldn't be focusing on such inappropriate things right now. Not while Gabriel was grieving. I will be, was his gruff reply. One of his hands trailed leisurely down my back, making my skin tingle. I pulled away slightly and looked up at him, trying to emerge from the lustful fog that his presence always brought. Where's Raziel? Somewhat distractedly. Achias preparing to leave. He said that he wants to talk to you before he goes. I frowned in puzzlement, unsure why the angel would ask for me specifically. Also, Jack contacted me. Your friend Maria is doing a lot better. It seems you helped her quite a lot. I mentally berated myself for nearly forgetting about Maria. All of the sorrow had distracted me. My best friend had been pretty badly injured in the battle. Ava had expended almost all of her energy healing everyone else, so it had to step in to aid Maria. It had been difficult at first, especially with my exhaustion, but he'd gotten my affinity to emerge again. Seems it done some good. I made a mental note to visit her in the infirmary, as I hadn't seen her since the night we'd gotten back. The thought of my newfound ability to help people made my wolf glow with pride. I could sense a similar emotion emanating from Gabriel. So what now? I murmured, drawing closer to my mate again. We work on the new village. It will be a good distraction for those that are grieving. I wondered if Gabriel meant to include himself in that group. His eyes found mine, and a burning emotion glimmered in their depths. But, before that, The breath left my body abruptly as Gabriel's hand fisted in the back of my hair, pulling it downwards so my chin tilted up. An instant later his mouth was crashing heatedly down upon mine. An incoherent thought deserted me. His kiss burned my lips and set my nerve endings on fire. When he pulled away before deepening the kiss, I felt incredibly bereft. I have to make up for leaving you. Slightly dizzy. I blinked and tried to get my bearings. Why you? I stammered, unable to form a complete sentence. Gabriel's eyes darted to my lips before meeting mine again. Regardless of my intentions, I know I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I could both hear and feel his sincerity and regret. I opened my mouth to grant him forgiveness before my wolf interrupted me. I like this idea. Make him work to earn our forgiveness. Her tone was mischievous and I instantly caught on to her meaning. The old Skylar would have been too nervy and embarrassed to try something like this. But I was different now. I knew what I wanted and how I was going to get it. I felt my lips quirk upward and I tried to school my expression into one of apathy. Part of me wondered if this was really a good time. Before my logical brain realized that this was what Gabriel needed. It was my duty to provide him with comfort, companionship and a distraction from his grief. Perhaps I can find it in me to forgive you eventually, I said slowly, keeping my eyes glued on his. I mentally willed my cheeks not to give away my shyness. Gabriel's expression was one of confusion before realization dawned, and one side of his mouth curved upward into a slight smirk. Eventually, he responded, an edge to his voice now, feigning ignorance. Well, you do have a lot of work to do. Gabriel's arm wrapped around me and in a split second I was pressed flush against him. He lowered his head until his mouth hovered just over the exposed mark on my neck. His hot breath swirled around the scar, sending delicious tingles shooting throughout my body. Slowly, deliberately, Gabriel pressed his mouth against the mark. I cowled and helped the gasp of pleasure that escaped me, and my hands automatically fisted in his shirt. His voice was husky when he pulled away to speak, and I knew the more primal side of his nature was emerging. But before Gabriel could echo the lustful thoughts swirling in his head, he suddenly froze and his brow creased in agitation. I was about to ask why when I caught a scent on the breeze, Raziel. The angel was nearby and quickly approaching. Gabriel turned to face me, bringing his free hand to cut my cheek. He wants to speak to you alone. His expression was regretful. I was still puzzled as to what the angel wanted, and a bit angry that the moment had been ruined, but I nodded anyway. I guess he'll catch up to you. My tone clearly gave away how I felt about the situation. We'll talk about this later. There was a promise evident in his eyes. Gabriel planted a light kiss on my lips before turning to leave. But my wolf statements from earlier came back to me, and I rushed forward. I had to speak before my courage deserted me. I knew it might come out as abrupt, but this was my chance to say it. There was no sense in waiting any longer. Wait, Gabriel. I bit my lip as he turned to face me expectantly. Well, after everything that happened, I don't see the point of hesitancy anymore, which is kinda funny, because I was always the most hesitant person before. Cowardly. But now I feel braver, especially since Kane is dead, and there aren't any other threats around. Yet so I think it's time to tell you how I feel. Now I know this might come across as a weird time, but I want to say it before Raziel gets here. So, Gabriel, I want to tell you, I know. Skylar. Mouth gaping open, staring up at him. I hadn't realized how badly he'd been rambling, but Gabriel's faint look of amusement confirmed it, as his words sank in. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I just didn't care anymore. I felt my spirit soar as I recognized the emotion he channeled through our bond. Gabriel's eyes contained a burning, overpowering sentiment that I could now place. It radiated through our mental link, and I knew I was returning it. And despite the fact that I hadn't vocalized my love for him, he knew. I wondered if Gabriel had known how deep my feelings ran as soon as he marked me. These thoughts were interrupted as Raziel's scent grew stronger. The still, for smell was accompanied by the rustling of undergrowth as he pushed his way through none too gently. The angel swiftly came into sight. Walking quickly, electric gaze focused on me. He briefly nodded at Gabriel who, with one last, lingering look at me, departed and left the two of us alone. I got the impression we would continue our conversation in depth later. I turned to face Raziel as he stopped a few feet away. I was still distracted by what Gabriel had said, and I blinked a few times to emerge from the happy days. Clearly this must have been important for the angel to come out here. Evening was approaching, and the rain had stopped during my time with Gabriel. The angel's dark hair was still slightly damp, and I could detect the obvious grief in his normally unfathomable eyes. I idly wondered just how old Raziel was. His emotions seemed so mortal, but every time I was in his presence, I could sense the otherworldly aura about him. I am leaving shortly after this, he began, eyes searching mine. What he was looking for, I did not know. Thank you for your son, thank you for everything, I replied, unsure what else to say. I should be thanking you. You're the one good thing that's ever happened to Gabriel. You helped us take down Cain. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Our packs will forever be grateful. Raziel sighed, running his hand slowly through his hair. Cain was a menace. I only wished I could have helped more. I got the impression that his regret wasn't really directed towards me. She really liked you, he continued, and I knew exactly to whom he was referring. She must be been a wonderful Luna, I said softly, echoing my thoughts from earlier. She may have been half werewolf, and that may have been the heritage she stuck to, but she had all the makings of a true angel. Raziel's mouth twisted in contemplation, and he gazed upwards at the sky, almost as if he could see Rebekah there. I wondered if she was watching over us. Heaven agreed with you. His gaze returned to settle on my face, and I tried not to show my discomfort at the intensity. I didn't think he'd ever completely get used to Raziel's presence, not the way I was used to other werewolves. That goes with what I wanted to talk to you about. Skylar. For some reason, I got the impression that Raziel was slightly more tense than before. I nodded for him to go on. While heaven seems incredibly distant to you, as it does to all mortal creatures, the angels aren't completely ignorant to what goes on down here. Perturbed, so they watch over Earth. In a way, they don't care about most day-to-day dealings. To my agent extraordinaire, Mylan Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. But certain things interest them. Like what? Like Cain's death, was his short reply. I blinked in surprise, some awareness being triggered in the back of my mind. My wolf stirred uncomfortably. They care about vampires. Wouldn't they just think of them as... I tried to find the right word. Scum. Indeed, they do. The angel crossed his arms over his chest, looking contemplative. But Cain has been around for as long as some angels have. He was one of the biggest scourges on this earth. He left quite a stain, so to speak. My mind vainly tried to put together exactly where Raziel was going with this. I must have looked confused because he sighed and continued. The death of a great evil like that is something to celebrate. It's a big deal, so to speak. Even in heaven. So they're proud of us for killing him. I felt like I was grasping at straws. You've caught their attention. Such a heroic feat does not go unnoticed. Raziel's eyes bored into me, and for some reason I got the impression that he didn't think capturing heaven's attention was a good thing, despite how his words sounded. More specifically, I should say Gabriel has caught their attention. He did the deed, and he has the angel lineage. Feeling a burst of nervousness for reasons I couldn't explain. You're saying that's a bad thing. All I'm saying, Skylar, is that you all did well, but just know that you should keep an eye out. You've attracted heaven's attention. His tone was solemn, but the angel wasn't finished. They'll be keeping an eye on you. What? We'll have a bunch of holy beings watching us, because we killed a vampire. Now I was intensely disturbed. I glanced up at the sky surreptitiously as if I could see winged creatures lurking above. Don't take this warning lightly. I thought you had the right to know. Did you tell Gabriel? Should I? Raziel's jaw clenched, and he slowly shook his head. I would not recommend it. Now I have to go. Skylar, I've said enough. To my surprise and irritation, after speaking so cryptically, the angel turned to leave. Goodbye, Skylar. Take care of Gabriel. He will need you. He was making his way in the opposite direction of the village. The words rung with warning, an ominous promise. I made an exasperated noise. You're just going to say something like that and then leave? Raziel hesitated, still turned away from me. A few seconds trickled by incomplete silence, and I felt my frustration building. Before I could add anything else, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for her unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He turned back over his shoulder. Don't worry. I'm sure I will be seeing you two again sooner than you think. With that, he was gone. Later that night, I lay in bed next to my mate, the man I loved. I was cold against him, our fingers interlaced, my cheek resting against his chest. I was sure my cheeks were lightly flushed. I could feel the faint sheen of sweat coating Gabriel's skin, and my own was dewy with perspiration. If it had any doubts at all about how Gabriel felt about me, they were now erased after our lovemaking. Ochidi put every ounce of passion and affection into it, and it felt the sincerity of his apology resounding throughout our bond. His guilt still lingered, no matter how many times I told him I'd forgiven him for leaving me. Truly, I understood why Ochidi left. It had hurt, but his actions had been selflessly motivated. Come to think of it, nearly everything Gabriel had ever done had been for selfless reason. I had been so wrong about him. It hated him and his pack from the day they started taking our land, mostly because of actions his father had taken before Gabriel was alpha. I could still remember the vehemence with which it renounced him the day before the meeting. Now, though, I knew better. Gabriel's actions against my pack had been cruel at times, but Ochidi been providing for his own in the way Chidi been taught. He didn't want the power or land for himself, everything was for the Black Mountains pack. I could never think of my pack suffering in a positive light, but I knew what made Gabriel do what he did. Hopefully, he could go about things more peacefully now that I was Luna. Thank you, came Gabriel's quiet voice, interrupting my thoughts. I tilted my head up to examine his face. His eyes were half closed, and I realized how exhausted he still looked. His eyelids began to droop as I watched. Just as quietly, Gabriel was silent for a long moment. As a minute passed, then two, without a response from him, I figured I wouldn't get an answer. As I was about to return to my former position and close my own eyes, he spoke again. For being mine. My cheeks warmed and I felt a rush of excitement at the frank words. I cowed and held the smile that formed on my face as I rested my cheek on his chest again, wrapping my arm around the large torso. I didn't need to formulate a response to that. Gabriel could sense the emotions infused in our mental link. I wondered if I'd ever get used to the soaring feeling I got in my stomach when my mate claimed me as his. Gabriel surprised me by letting out a small snort of derision, and he said I would never be able to love. He wrapped his arm around me and drew me even closer until our bodies were melded into one. This brought me up short. I was at a loss for words. Hearing the word love escape Gabriel's mouth in conjunction with me left me feeling lightheaded and dizzy. I had sensed the emotion through our bond, but by vocalizing it, it was just that much sweeter. I had no doubt that the he to whom Gabriel referred was his father, David, the cruel alpha that had been the first to start treating my pack like dirt, and apparently treated his own family worse. I cowed and held the morbid curiosity that struck me as I wondered what happened to Gabriel's father. He never told me, but at a time like this, when my mate was only temporarily distracted from his grief, I knew I shouldn't ask. Still, the thought of David telling his own son that he would never love made my blood boil. I vehemently hoped that he had gotten what was coming to him. When I glanced up at him again, I realized Gabriel was asleep. I'd never seen him so peaceful. I'd never seen him sleep at all. I let my eyes run over the regal features, sculpted lips, infirm jawline. He didn't exactly look like the savage alpha that his reputation made him out to be. Perfect, my wolf thought. To my agent extraordinaire, Marion Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. She growled agreement. I watched him sleep unabashedly for several minutes before deciding it was time I do the same. Yet, when I pulled the blanket up over my body and inhaled the masculine scent surrounding me, sleep would not come. When I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for it to take me away, I was still left wide awake. My wolf stirred in my mind, something agitating her and leaving her uncomfortable. I tried to soothe her, not wanting the emotions to wake Gabriel up. It only took me a minute longer to realize what was bothering me. It was what Raziel said earlier. I could not get the angel's words out of my head. As I lifted my head again and gazed upon Gabriel's face, seeing him sleep for the first time, the cryptic phrases echoed in my mind and kept me awake and restless. I gently ran my fingers down his peaceful face. I was unwilling to burden him with what Raziel had told me. I wanted Gabriel's face to be this worry-free forever. Careful not to wake him, I snuggled even closer, inhaling his scent in an effort to calm my wolf. Like me, Raziel's words had left her restless. I pressed my hands flat against Gabriel's contoured chest. I was happy, and I was in love. Cain was dead. Despite our losses, I should be fast asleep next to my mate. But, even as I lay there, my eyes remained wide open. Despite the major obstacles we had just overcome, I could not sleep, because even though I knew we were safe here, and I knew that I was just beginning a long and happy life with Gabriel, Raziel's warning lingered. Because even though I should be thinking about how many pups we would have and what our home in the third pack village would look like, my eyes inevitably kept darting upwards, fixating on the ceiling, as if my gaze could bore through it and into the night sky beyond. As I remained awake and unnerved, I knew I was still far away from sleep tonight despite the bright future ahead of me, because regardless of my happiness, my instincts would not let me sleep. And Raziel's warning rang true in the back of my mind, no matter how far away they were, or what dimension or universe they were in. The angels, powerful beings beyond my comprehension, were there, watching us,